Yeah, thank you, Debbie. Hi. I feel like you should be doing this presentation because your voice is so much more pleasant than mine, but I guess you're stuck with me. So I'm presenting because I brought this idea for this initiative to the ACLCA PCR committee. And before I dive into the details, maybe real quick, in case you you don't know me, I'm the technical director of ThinkStep, or I'm the technical director of ThinkStep Inc., which is the North American branch of the ThinkStep AG out of Germany. We're an LCA service and software provider, and at any given day of the year, we probably have around 30 to 50 LCA or EPD projects, and in fact, EPDs is a big part of our business currently because of the lead system. So ISO 21930 is, of course, also limited or specific to the building and construction uh, industry. It's currently being updated, and yeah, we see certain issues that on the horizon for when this standard is published. So I'm just going to go ahead and go through my slides right now. Oh, I'm clicking on the screen. No, it's Debbie, of course. So first the problem description, then what we're proposing to do, and then the potential next steps. So in terms of problems description, if you go to the next one, right. So currently there's a European norm 15804, which serves as a core PCR for the building and construction sector, at least in Europe, but also a program operator like ULE, for example, works with German program operators or European operators. So also EPDs published under ULE would conform to EN 15804 currently. Next. It requires the reporting of 7 impact categories, which in Europe are based on CML. Over here, we would add Tracy results to the picture. Next. Debbie? Oh, okay. And additionally, the standard requires reporting of 10 metrics for resource use, 3 metrics for disposed waste, and 3 metrics for recycled wastes, which are not impact assessment categories. However, in the standard, there's minimal to actually no guidance on how to calculate some of these metrics. So while people agreed that it's important to report on them, they didn't, in this standard, they didn't agree on how to calculate them. So usually in practice, what you see are bilateral agreements with program operators and verifiers in lieu of any further guidance. And this unfortunately leads to the fact that, we all know that even impact category indicator results are sometimes hard to compare, but for these metrics, comparability is even lower unless the numbers were calculated by the same practitioner, using the same software and verified by the same verifier, because even those may have differing opinions of how to calculate these. And now ISO 21930, which is currently under revision and will probably be published not too far in the future, is very likely, or at this point almost certain, to adopt most, if not all, of these 15804 metrics. So the revision of 21930 will essentially be the EN 15804 elevated to ISO level with, I don't know how significant changes will be made. I'm not part of that ISO committee, by the way, so that would be other people on our PCR committee that are involved, but not me. I am very busy with the ISO committee for the 1420 series and the 1444. So just to tell you exactly what we're talking about, these are the tables from EN 15804. These are the resource use metrics. So it's mostly about energy resources, either used as energy or used as a material. but also use of secondary material or secondary renewable fuels, for example, and so forth. Water is in there, so everything around resource use. And then there are two more tables. One is about hazardous and non-hazardous and radioactive waste, and then other environmental information. Like components for reuse, materials for recycling, and so forth. Though these are all mandatory to be reported in EPDs based on 15804 and very likely based on 21930, the new and revised version. Now, what is the trouble with these? Why is it sometimes difficult to calculate these? And these are just example questions, just really off the top of my head or my colleague's head when we do these types of EPDs. So, for example, if you look at the metric, the use of renewable or non-renewable primary energy resources used as raw materials, the question is, how do you calculate this? So a current or a common way to address this is to calculate this metric simply by looking at the material composition of the final product and then basing it on the lower heating value. And then you sum that up. Question is that really the best way? Because you're not really looking at the entire value chain and any and all renewable energy resources that may be used as raw materials, but only what ends up in your final product. Then if you're using a lower heating value, the question is, which lower heating value do I use? Is there a standard reference, or do I just Google it? And then last but not least, there was a question, or is it a question, and program operators may decide to address this differently, whether this should include packaging or not. Because if packaging is part of your system boundary, then the renewable primary energy resources used as raw materials may include the wood that is in your shipping pallet. The other ones are similar. If you look at the use of secondary fuels, the question, which really applies to most of these metrics, is, well, what are you asking for? Are you asking for just for these, let's say, uses or flows that in the foreground system, or also for the entire background system? And that's can, of course, be a challenge whenever you calculate or set up your inventory using partially or entirely aggregated data sets, because then some of this information simply wouldn't be available to the practitioner. Also, the question is, does it need to be, is that what they're asking for, or is this really about the foreground system, right? Third example, the hazardous waste disposed. Whenever you talk about the distinction between hazardous and non-hazardous, it is a legal one. It's not natural science. There's a European waste catalog that describes what is a hazardous waste and what isn't, and in the States that may be slightly different. The question is, which rule do you use, and how does that correspond to the background database you're using? Because the biggest LCI databases, commercial ones, Gabi and EcoInvent, are from Europe, so they would probably use the European waste catalog for that distinction. So these are just examples of questions we want to discuss and clarify and agree on. Next. Then the Europeans, they did notice that there is significant confusion in the field about how to calculate these metrics. So they did start another standardization effort, and that resulted in a technical rule, EN/TR 16970, which is a guidance on the implementation of 15804. Next. At the time when I made these slides for the first time, I think it was maybe November, it already had been submitted to send for publication, so that will come out pretty soon if it hasn't already. However, while it provides some more guidance, it's really just the smallest common denominator, because that's the nature of a standardization process on the European level or the ISO level. So it's really what is in there is really not sufficient to ensure, or to maximize the comparability of the results for these metrics. Apart from that, talking to someone who was took a very active part in that process, it was a very long and tedious standardization process because of all these discussions and because people were only able to agree on the smallest common denominator. Nevertheless, we thought we could give it a try. So, a member from the ACLCA PCR committee who is involved in the ISO 21930 revision submitted a proposal for the US as part of the US Commons to develop a TS, which is the ISO equivalent to a TR. Oh no, there's a TR in the ISO 2, sorry about that. But anyways, we submitted a proposal for a TS to specify 21930. We don't think that's going to be successful, especially on the international level, and especially from countries that just went through the CEN process to develop the TR document, and it was very painful, so they probably have no interest, in reliving that pain again. So the question is now, what are we going to do about it, and what are we going to do about it specifically for North America? So the proposal goes like this. We wanted, well, whether we'll call it a roundtable, but this initiative primarily will be focused on these metrics, but it could be a wider roundtable on EPDs if it is successful. And so the first task will be on any additional guidance necessary to maximize the comparability of these metrics. And we can use the technical rule once published as a basis and then compare it to the draft or the current version of 21930 and see in how far that helps us. But in the end, we want to publish a guide to these metrics either in parallel or shortly after 21930 is published. But that's a moving target, of course, because you don't really know when exactly something will be published by ISO. Even if the work is done, then there's the editing committee, and that can take a little while too. So let's say we want to be as close to the release or publication of 21930 as we can. If there is still a chance for submitting comments, and I think that train has pretty much left the station at this point, at least for technical comments, we could still try to submit them to that subcommittee under ISO. But I already put this into gray font because I think that door is closing rapidly. So in the end, as the goal, with publishing this guide, we want to make sure that we maximize the comparability as far as possible across different softwares, different databases, and different practitioners for North America. The structure we kind of came up with was to have a small drafting group of maybe 5 to 10 volunteers, not set in stone, but if we go significantly over 10, then it's just not going to be very efficient and very productive, I think. So have a smaller drafting group and then have a larger stakeholder group for feedback and comments on whatever the drafting group provides. The open consultation, I mean, we're not doing this development of this guide under any standard that would define how this is supposed to be developed. So an open consultation is not required by anyone or anything, but of course recommended if we want to achieve consensus on the contents. And then we, in the end, once it's all said and done, we can publish this guide on the ACLCA website for free, of course, not for purchase. And then just update it in parallel with future revisions to 21.930. So we've reached out to potential members of this larger stakeholder group in the last quarter of last year, and we got quite some interest. So these are the people that have already raised their hands and said, yes, we want to be part of the larger stakeholder group at least. And the webinar today, of course, serves to, make this more widely known and maybe increase the participation even more. So the next steps after this webinar, we've done all of the top things. So the next steps would really to organize the kickoff meeting. I think a doodle for that kickoff meeting will go out very soon. And then communicate the kickoff meeting once it's scheduled, through a press release as well. And then it's really just about doing the work. So that was, I think, my part for today. So I'm going to give it back to Debbie at this point.
Okay, great. I just wanted to mention to those who have just joined the webinar to please feel free to enter your questions into the box on the GoTo meeting or GoTo webinar so we can get those questions to Chris. And just to let you know that Najee is also on the line. So I'm going to read off the first question that we have here. It says, the working environment is currently not included in 219.30.2007. Is it included in 15.804 and or the new version of 219.30? Is that
the working environment?
Yeah.
I can only assume or guess what the question is aiming at, but my gut feeling would be no. But yeah, I'm not part of that working group or that ISO technical committee. I'm not a member there, so I wasn't actively involved in the development of 21.930. We have Tom Gloria, who is an ACLCA member, and we have Anna Nicholson from ULE, who were both more actively involved in that regard. So we can collect any of those questions and forward them to see whether they can give us that information. Other than that, yeah, at this point I can't really say yes or no.
Okay,
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I've chatted with the asker or the person who raised the question, and I think I have a better understanding of what the term working environment means. So in that context, the ISO 21930/2007 website talks about that the working environment is not included into the standard because it's normally subject to for national legislation. I think my guess and also the asker's guess is that it would mean the workers who are involved in the building and construction. So the question is whether that would be involved. To my knowledge, no, but it could be. Again, they could change it at any point. I don't believe EN 15804, the European standards, tackles the working environment aspect.
Great. All right, we have another question. Where does risk assessment of hazardous and non-hazardous waste fit into 15804 or impact EPDs?
It doesn't. I mean, EPDs are based on ISO 14025, so they are LCA based. An EPD is a communication tool for LCA results, LCA is not risk assessment. So you can, of course, communicate risk assessment results as part of the additional environmental information in any EPD if you so choose, but that's not mandatory at all, and there is no guidance which risk assessment methodology to use if you do it.
Great. So our next question is, this appears to have goals similar to the enhanced PCR guidance that UL and USGBC assembled last year. Does this build on that effort, or is it connected in any way? I feel that the target audience for each overlaps considerably.
Yeah, but so I'm on the technical advisory panel for USGBC ULE initiative, and we didn't talk about metrics and how to calculate them at all. That was just about what should be communicated in which form to increase transparency. But it's not at all about these types of discussions where we are, okay, how do we calculate this? Which lower heating value do we use? That's way, way, way down in the weeds. And that was not the scope of the USGBC initiative.
And what I would add to this is that USGBC as well as UL, and UL has confirmed their willingness to participate or as a committed stakeholder. And I will add that USGBC has been invited to also participate.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have one other question. Will the proposed document include details on how to calculate the proposed metrics for the stakeholder?
Yes.
Can you repeat the question? Because, I mean, the whole point of this initiative is to provide detailed guidance on how to calculate these metrics.
Exactly.
Right. So that is the core. And this is not going to be a guide to ISO 21930 overall. Maybe once we tackle these metrics, we can move on, and if we have a good group going, you know, and are very productive, maybe we can then discuss other things that are unclear in 21930. But for starters, we just want to focus on these metrics, because in EPDs, usually people look at the numbers first. And if the numbers are not comparable at all, then there's really no point in communicating them.
Okay, great. So as a follow-up to one of the questions someone had put down, with the significant change in the TSCA, I don't know if that gives you enough, Chris.
So that's called TESCA, and the follow-up came as a result, you know, from the question originally that dealt with the risk assessment of hazardous and non-hazardous waste and how they fit into EPDs. Again, my understanding is that TESCA deals with hazard assessments, and I have really superficial knowledge on it. But back to Chris's point that EPDs are LCA based and they don't include any risk assessment.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. Oh, sorry.
I mean, they can include, right? But it's voluntary, and it's not defined anywhere how to do it. In the additional environmental information, you can communicate whatever you want as long as it's related to environmental performance or aspects.
Great. So our next question is there a consensus on a minimum set of the characterization factors that should be included for all EPDs or PCRs?
Characterization factors are about life cycle impact assessment categories, and we're not touching those. I mean, those are, I don't know what the exact language will be, but I'm assuming that for North America, we're going to use the Tracy 2.1 characterization factors, or most, let's say most PCRs that will be written based on the new 21930 will most likely require you to report Tracy 2.1 impact categories. Now in Europe, the EN, they actually published published an annex to EN 15804, which contains characterization factors. It's just one huge table of characterization factors, and they're based on a certain version of CML. Now, that's a terrible idea to standardize something like this, because before that annex was published, CML had already released 2 updates of that methodology. Apart from that, in different softwares, you may find additional characterization factors that are not contained in that annex. So it's not, yeah, I think it's not, characterization factors are not something you standardize. That's a moving target.
Okay, the next question is, the speaker touched on improving comparability of metrics across software databases and practitioners. In ISO 21930, talks about comparisons to be done at the whole building construction works level. How does this work intend to deal with that requirement?
Can you repeat the question? I think I couldn't quite make the leap.
Okay, sorry. The speaker touched on improving comparability of metrics across software, databases, and practitioners. ISO 21930 talks about comparisons to be done at the whole building/construction works level. How does this work intend to deal with that requirement?
Well, oh, I see. Well, I mean, these numbers that we are trying to get, maybe comparability is not the right word. Let's say consistency. So the intent is not that you compare those numbers, but those numbers are meant to inform comparisons, so they still need to be consistent, and they're not currently. So first we have to improve the numbers before we can take those numbers and perform any kinds of comparisons on a building level.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how different is the proposed version of ISO 21930 to EN 15804 in regards to the requirements for comparability?
I think it pretty much says the same thing, but like I said, I wasn't actively commenting. I've seen a draft or 2 in between from different, colleagues of mine. Yeah, I don't know the exact language, but the provision that comparisons in the building and construction space should only be performed on a building level. I don't think that's going to go away, because that's a very important one.
Great. Someone has a question whether there's a process set up for submitting interest in joining the roundtable or the small drafting group.
Yes, any of the 3 email addresses you see on the screen will work.
Great. Regarding the working environment, EPD should cover environmental impacts in factories and on-site if installation is included, but not impacts during product and building design, not health and safety in factories or on-site. So I guess someone's commenting on one of the questions that were thrown out.
All right.
Is your goal from this presentation to look for working group members only, or are you also wanting participants in the feedback review committee? How would you like us to express interest?
Well, yeah, I mean, right now we're looking for participation in the larger stakeholder group. That larger stakeholder group will attend the kickoff meeting, and one of the first agenda items for the kickoff would, of course, be have people volunteer to be on the drafting committee. So right now we're trying to set up the larger stakeholder group, and then the defining who will be on the drafting group will be the next step. If we have too many people volunteering, then we'll have to come up with a mechanism to find a balanced representation, and that's if you go back to the table again with the people who have already kind of signaled interest. Nothing beats a little bit of peer pressure. So that's why we have these 4 columns, because that's what we would consider kind of a balanced representation. So the drafting committee should, if we're aiming for 10 people roughly, then it should be hopefully 2 people from each of these columns that make up the drafting group. But that's a discussion to be had at the kickoff meeting.
Okay, great. That looks like all of the questions that we have. If there aren't any others, I'll just, first of all, thank Chris for the presentation and just point out, as Chris had mentioned, the 3 email addresses. Please do not hesitate to contact Christoph, Naji, or myself with any questions you may have. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded, and I will be sending it out to everyone who registered for the webinar, as well as posting it on the ACLCA website. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.
Debbie, before we hang up, because we do want to send out the doodle for the kickoff meeting, should we maybe aim for, let's say a 2-week time window from today for people to signal that they want to be invited to the kickoff meeting? Just came to my mind.
Yeah, no, that's great. And when we send out the follow-up email to everyone who registered, I'll be sure to mention that in the email. So everyone on the phone now, if people have left, you know that there's a 2-week period to get in contact so that we can add you to the interest list. Great. Is there anything else, Chris or Naji, you'd like to add before we sign off?
Nothing. I think I agree with you. I'll forward the email to everybody who attended the call today, just in case they would like to show interest, and then we'll send out the doodle poll. So thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good afternoon.